Hello and welcome to my garden and welcome to my studio, my natural environment. I'm going to take you on a journey through how I make various pieces of work and talk a little bit about various digital and physical approaches to casting glass. Hope that I might answer some questions about things that you might have thought about before, and just generally introduce you to how I create my artwork. Here we are entering into the studio, which is now called Shedtopia, as it's created, as you can see, out of a number of buildings joined together. Thinking about making this video, I wanted to show it as a life cycle of an object, or life cycle of object, process, material, thought process. And I view that process very much as something that's like a chicken and egg, if you like. So at this moment, I'm looking at a mold that's come out of the kiln and thinking about that as the egg, if you like, out of which is going to come something that's that could represent new life. And at the point where I'm demolding and looking at what I've got, looking at what's worked, some things are quite unexpected. Some things are as I hoped that they would be. I'm not only looking at this object, but it's triggering ideas, future ideas, developments on from this, variations, thinking maybe about different colours, different effects. At the point where you've got the piece in your hand, you can really start to examine what you've got from what you started with. And this was made, and this one also, from a combination of both organic and 3D printed pieces of material. I did these in what we would call burnout molds. These I'm thinking about as being possibly wall pieces or pieces that would be seen in a window, as I just showed you, with a lot of light going through them, because the work that I do in general works very much with light, and colour is also important to me. Although clear glass can be very, very beautiful in a minimal way, I most often use colour. And to me, colour emphasises the form, and form is really something that's so key to my work and always has been right from when I started out. So here I'm collaging together combinations of organic materials, which might be things I've found in the garden or things that I've saved. I've got half lemons that I've squeezed in the kitchen, poppy heads, things like that. Maybe rose hips. And I'm also working with little pieces of 3D print material. Some of them are forms that I've designed and printed, and some of them are actually the scraps of scaffolding and things from the print bed, which I also find really interesting texturally. And they're particularly interesting, I think, in combination with organics, because you've got that contrast between the natural form and the man-made. Now I'm going to talk through how I would work digitally, and I still usually start from an analog starting point, which perhaps like this would be a sketch from my sketchbook, and I would generate that into a Rhino and then 3D print from the Rhino file. So this is the Bicelops piece in cast glass. And one of the very beautiful things about working digitally is about being able to change the scale and recreate the same object across a range of scales. And I call that sort of repeat with difference. So we've got this tiny piece here, and then we've got a much larger version here. And you can see when I turn this in the light that it's a double-walled core casting with a connecting finger of glass that joins those two concentric egg shapes together. So both of these objects are generated from the same digital file and then made with traditional glassmaking processes, where instead of having a lost wax, I've got a PLA form which I can burn out of the mould and then melt the glass into that cavity. This vessel lineup is another example of repeat with difference. where not only the scale has changed, but also I've subtly changed the form, which you can usually do at the pre-print option on the 3D printer. So you've got infinite possibilities of both form and scale from one initial file. And the Rhino file for this is actually really very simple, but it gives you a wealth of opportunities. And all of these things are made very much more accessible through the use of digital than you would ever be able to create by hand processes alone. This piece is called After the Fire. And as you can see, this also uses my kind of improvised three-dimensional collage methodology of creating the initial model out of the 3D print, which you can see here is the blue form on the left, and combining that with some carved wood to create a model that's going to be sacrificial, basically. So I would make the refractory mold around this and then burn out the whole of the inside. So it's very much a one-off piece. But the result from that is that you get this incredible level of detail, and the casting process unifies these two very different materials to create one monumental form, but on quite a miniature scale, because this piece is probably only about 20-25 centimeters high. But you can see on the right that I used a black glass, and every tiny mark in the wood and every tiny action of the printer is really quite visible in terms of the 3D print. So I think this piece personifies some of the qualities that I was trying to achieve through the research that I did for my PhD. Back for a quick look at the collage to kind of round off the idea of the process. And because, as I say, form is the overriding importance to me, and then how that works with light and colour once it's cast in glass. And those are really key principles that have underpinned my work right through from when I was a student. Now what I'm going to do is to sort of, using a very simple wax model, I'm going to just run through sort of how you'd set up the model, how you'd mix and pour the mold, and then steam the wax out. Or it could be burned out PLA, it could be burned out organic material, through to get a hollow mold that you can then melt glass in. So this section is all about basic casting processes. I've got a little tiny bird on an egg here, which is something that I'm making while I'm in lockdown in the studio. I'm making this for my friend's little boy, because I found a bird's nest in the hedge, and he absolutely loves birds. So I thought I would make him a little egg and a hatching bird to go inside of it. So this is wax, and I've set it up on a small amount of plasticine, which will create the reservoir in the mold where I will put the glass later. And I've added a cotton thread, which will give a very, very fine air hole going through the refractory plaster to let out any air that might be trapped inside the glass, and to ensure that all the details of the tail and the beak will be cast in the glass when it's melted in the kiln. Now I'm using a cut down yogurt pot as a piece of cottling. One of the things that I like to do is to sort of, as much as possible, sort of use things rather than just throwing them away. And we all know that there's such a mammoth plastic issue in the whole world that I think any plastic that you can reuse a number of times before you even put it in the recycling is going to make a sort of positive difference. And I think that sort of philosophy is increasingly important to me in the way that I work. And the small scale that I'm working on really is also part of that, because creating cast glass on a large scale, although you get some incredible and wonderful results, it's a very expensive thing to do. And it's also then, quite problematic perhaps to market those objects on such a large scale, because there's so much embedded time and material and energy in creating of them. So for the last few years, I've been working on a very small scale, and I can cover a lot more ground in terms of exploring ideas, in terms of exploring different techniques and combinations and methods of making. So it's suiting me very well to have changed from much larger work. Now we're moving on to the actual mold mix stage of things, and the recipe that I'm using here is a very simple one that comes from previous research that I carried out about 20 years ago into what were then contemporary techniques, looking at makers right across Europe, in America, in New Zealand. And out of that, I synthesized a number of very basic recipes which I would be using on a regular basis in the studio. So I'm using a third plaster, a third fine silica, and a third of Ludo, which is basically old molds that have been crushed up and sieved back to a powder. And then I would be just regularly dry mixing those together and adding them to water to create my new refractory mix. While I'm going to pour molds, I'm also creating reservoirs, separate reservoirs to add on top of the mold, because for small pieces, I usually put in quite a lot more glass than I know will actually be needed to cast the object. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is that sometimes it's easier to cold work it afterwards when you've still got quite a large amount of glass to get hold of at the base. The extra weight and volume of glass is good if you've got lots of fine details, and on this little bird, things like the tail and the beak, where the glass might be reluctant to flow in there. If you've got extra weight and pressure, it helps to sort of push the glass down. And it's actually, in some cases, easier just to cut off a bigger reservoir at the end, and then you've got a reasonable chunk of glass that you can use again in an even smaller mold. So it's good to have an extra reservoir space, and then you can also you can choose your recycled piece of glass to fit the piece that you're making, and create a special reservoir funnel shape in order to kind of meet the entry point into the mold. And this is a very quick way of making reservoirs. And you can use any number of different containers to do that, as long as you've got a reasonable thickness of the wall around it. And I usually put water in the inner container because it helps to weigh it down, and then you end up with a nice clean ring shape at the end. There we go, pressing the little pot of water inside the other smaller container. Some of these are little silicon cooking molds as well that I bought in a charity shop. So I'm always on the lookout for useful shapes and sizes, and quite a lot of things that have been made for domestic use are useful in the studio. At this point, the plaster's probably getting really quite thick, and sometimes I do hand build molds, in which case having it as a slightly thicker consistency is quite good, because you can actually sort of paste on the last layer. But on very small objects, I think cottling up, as I have done here, and pouring is usually the best way of doing it, and eliminating any air from the mixture. I think you probably saw as I was setting up as well that I put lots of rubber bands around the cottling, and that has meant that no plaster has leaked out, but also that I haven't needed to use clay or anything to keep the cottling together. So it's a nice clean way of doing it. And I've now got lots of little tiny sort of round wooden bases that I can fit the cottling to nice and closely, and then rubber band in place. So sometime later, you can start to take these things apart, and sometimes it can be a little bit fiddly to get the containers out the center. The trick is not to overfill. I think the one I've just put to one side, I've slightly overfilled, and so it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get the small pot out of the bigger pot. And the water that was inside them has already been poured on the plants outside the back door. And here we go, this one comes out really easily because it's been filled to a reasonable level. I also find lots of these little tiny rings are useful, because sometimes I might stack more than one reservoir on top of the other. I usually make a number of them and then keep them on top of the kiln, taking off the cottling on the outside. And as you'll see, it's a nice clean result. And then the little wooden base can be removed very easily. And also you can set up again very quickly if you need to keep reusing the same cottling and the same setter base on the inside. Hand lapping to flatten the base of the mold here. And I'm just removing the plasticine from the bottom now. And again, using plasticine is a very clean way of setting up, because with clay you inevitably get some of it stuck to the plaster, which you then have to usually get out with a damp sponge or something, and you run the risk of leaving small amounts of clay in your reservoir area which can stick to the glass. So I tend to use plasticine or plastiline or terracotta wax to set up, and it's quicker and easier and cleaner to take out. And also you don't have to make the mold wet, because actually you want it to start drying out. And there's the little reservoirs to go with. So the next stage is steaming the wax out. Very simple. I've just got wallpaper steamers and set the nozzle up inside the mold, put something like a plastic bucket over the top and watch the wax drip out. And then here we are, my little wood burning stove in the corner, and with the molds and the reservoirs drying out towards loading the kiln. So packing the kiln, I use the roof of the kiln, and I normally dry the molds in a previous firing on top of the kiln. There go all the little reservoirs stacked up, and I've got plenty of them there to choose from, so that you can choose the size to go with the molds. And then I usually water displace if I'm steaming wax, and then load the glass ready to fire. And I've got a smaller piece at the bottom, which is an open mold, which is a little sort of test piece, so that I can do some colour tests or some texture tests, and the main firing is at the top. And even in the small kiln, I've got quite a number of pieces in there at this point. So thank you very much, and do get in touch if you'd like to. I'm really happy to talk about molds, talk about casting glass. If you're interested in coming to do a course, I'm teaching both in my own studio and sometimes with Max Jacquard down at Greensand Barn. And occasionally, obviously, I'm teaching in other countries as well. So do keep in touch. Look at my website and my Instagram. Thank you. Bye-bye.